All right, welcome. Today we are diving deep into 1 Corinthians. And let me tell you, it's one of the most practical, but also one of the most challenging letters in the entire New Testament. So if you've ever opened it up and felt a little lost, you are in the right place. We're about to make it all make sense.
So, let's just jump right in with the question. What do you do when a church is filled with these brilliant, gifted, passionate people, but it's also kind of a complete mess? I mean, we're talking riddled with divisions, scandals, and just all sorts of confusion. Well, believe it or not, the Apostle Paul faced that exact situation, and his response was this powerful, direct, and incredibly helpful letter we call 1 Corinthians.
So here's the game plan for our time together. We're going to start with the big picture idea. Then we'll set the scene and travel back to the ancient city of Corinth. After that, we'll see how Paul centers every single solution on Jesus, explore why this letter is so unbelievably important for us today, and then finally, we'll break down the letter's grand plan so you can navigate it like a pro.
Okay, first things first, the big picture. Look, to really get what Paul is saying, we have to understand why he was writing in the first place. What was the urgent problem he was so desperately trying to solve?
So, what was the root problem in Corinth? You can boil it all down to one word: pride. They were boasting about everything. Their favorite celebrity teachers, their worldly wisdom, their social status. And Paul's solution? It was to completely redirect their boasting. He tells them, hey, stop glorying in human leaders and instead boast in God alone. His whole argument is that if they can just get this one thing right, it's going to naturally lead to the unity and the purity their church was so badly lacking.
And you can see right here just how practical this letter is. Paul was writing for two main reasons. First, he'd gotten some really disturbing reports from Chloe's household, about all the divisions and immorality. And second, the church had actually sent him a letter with a whole list of questions they had. So you can think of 1 Corinthians as his direct response to both the bad news he heard and the specific questions they asked.
Now, to really grasp Paul's advice, we need to understand the world he was writing to. So let's take a step back in time to first century Corinth. It's a wild place.
First up, who wrote it? Well, it's the Apostle Paul. He says so in the very first verse, and honestly, his authorship is universally accepted. There's no real debate. The letter's style, its theology, plus we have confirmation from early church leaders, it all points directly to him. Remember, Paul founded this church, so he's writing as their spiritual father, and he's deeply concerned about them.
And who is he writing to? The church in Corinth, a community Paul himself had spent 18 long months with. Now, these guys were a vibrant group, no doubt about it, but they were really struggling to separate themselves from the culture all around them, which was, let's just say, deeply pagan. It was filled with idol worship and morals that were the complete opposite of what Paul taught. They were having a tough time being in the world, but not of it.
This timeline here gives us some really important context. You can see Corinth was refounded as this big Roman colony way back in 44 BC. Fast forward about a century, and around AD 50, Paul shows up and plants the church. And then it's just a few years after that, around AD 54-55, that he writes this very letter from the city of Ephesus.
So what was life actually like in Corinth? Well, it was a bustling, super wealthy, and incredibly worldly Roman port city. As a major trade hub, it was a total crossroads of cultures and ideas. It even hosted the famous Isthmian Games, which were second only to the Olympics. But its reputation for moral corruption was so widespread that the slang term to Corinthianize literally came to mean living a life of drunken debauchery. This was the cultural air the Corinthian believers were breathing in every single day.
So because of all that, 1 Corinthians isn't some abstract book of theology. It's what we call an occasional letter, which just means it was written for a specific occasion to address real-life problems. The best way to think of it is as a pastor writing to his people, trying to lovingly but firmly guide them back to spiritual health. So with all those problems swirling around, the pride, the division, the immorality, what was Paul's single overarching solution? Well, that brings us to our next section, finding Jesus in Corinth. You'll see that for Paul, every problem in that church had the same ultimate answer.
The Corinthians, they just loved human wisdom and impressive, eloquent speakers. So what was Paul's response? He points them to Christ crucified. He basically says, oh, you're impressed by what the world thinks is wise? Well, the very core of my message, a crucified Messiah, looks like absolute foolishness to the world. But guess what? It's actually the ultimate display of God's power and wisdom. The cross just completely shatters human pride.
And how did he confront the shocking immorality that they were just tolerating in the church? He pointed them again, straight back to Jesus.
For Christ, our Passover lamb has been sacrificed. His logic here is so powerful. Just like the Israelites had to clean all the old yeast out of their homes for Passover, the church has to deal with its sin because they are a brand new community, totally purified by Christ's ultimate sacrifice.
And for all those issues of personal morality, Paul gives this game-changing reminder. You are not your own. You were bought at a price. He's saying their lives and yet even their bodies, they don't belong to them anymore. They belong to Christ, who paid the ultimate price to redeem them. And because of that, their lives should be lived to honor God. You see the pattern here? The answer is always, always Jesus.
Okay, so that's all really fascinating history, but you might be thinking, why should this letter, written to one specific church almost 2,000 years ago, matter to me? That's a great question. Let's look at why 1 Corinthians is truly a letter for today.
You know, the problems in Corinth are, frankly, the same problems churches still face today. How do we handle division and actually pursue unity? What's the real importance of sexual purity and a godly marriage? How do we use our freedom in Christ to serve other people, not just ourselves? How are spiritual gifts supposed to build up the church in love instead of just puffing us up with pride? And why is the bodily resurrection of Jesus an absolute, non-negotiable truth of our faith? 1 Corinthians gives us timeless, gospel-centered wisdom for every single one of these challenges.
All right, for our final section, let's look at the letter's grand plan. Just think of this as a simple blueprint, like a mental map that's going to help you navigate the book yourself, so you always know where you are and where Paul is going next.
The structure is actually super logical once you see it. It starts with an introduction, a greeting and thanksgiving. Then in chapters 1 through 6, Paul just tackles all those problems that were reported to him. Then starting in chapter 7, he shifts gears and systematically answers the questions the church had asked him in their letter. And finally, he wraps it all up with a conclusion. So really, just think of it in two big parts. First, he deals with what he heard, and then he deals with what they asked.
And that really brings us to our final takeaway. Paul wrote to a gifted but deeply flawed church, and he called them to stop glorying in themselves and to start living for the glory of God alone. And so the question this ancient letter leaves us with is a really powerful one. How does it challenge us in our own lives and our own churches to do the very same thing today?